Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. Thanks for joining us, and from so many diverse areas in the world. My name is Joanne Longton, and I'm the IoT Community Manager for the Artificial Intelligence Technical Network. I've popped my details on the screen right now, so please do get in touch with me if you're interested in learning more about the network or you just want to get more involved. We're always looking for new volunteers on the committee, and we have vacancies each year, so please do feel free to drop me a line. Also, if you have any ideas for any future events or webinars that you'd like to see us do, I'm very happy to receive those suggestions. And again, you can just pop those on an email directly to me. As I said, this webinar today is brought to you by the Artificial Intelligence Network. This is a worldwide technical network which supports the growth of AI by promoting and challenging conventional approaches in businesses and society. There's a link in the resource box to our online community, and I highly recommend you have a look and join us. Just going to go through a little bit of housekeeping before we get started on the presentation. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a widget bar with a set of buttons on it, and you can open them by clicking on them and closing them by minimizing. I particularly want to highlight the Q&A button, so please enter your questions for Kirsten by typing them into that box anytime during the presentation. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. And if you can't see the Q&A box, click on the highlighted button on the widget bar and it will pop up for you. If you have any technical issues during the presentation today, can you just let us know by putting it in the Q&A box and we'll get some immediate help for you. One thing to note also, if your slides are not moving during the presentation, you'll probably need to refresh your screen. So that's either by pressing F5 for Windows or Command R on a Mac. And if you have a slow connection, you probably will need to do that a little bit more regularly. So I think that's enough from me. I'm going to introduce Kirsten now. Kirsten, as well as being active on our Artificial Intelligence Committee, Kirsten's a systems engineer and artificial intelligence lead at General Dynamics Missions System UK. And she leads research of AI-based solutions across multiple applications, including within the air and ground domain. And aside from her technical role in developing AI, she also leads on research in the wider implications and implementation of AI, such as ethics and safety, and has presented at a number of international and UK MOD lectures and conferences on those topics. So without further ado, I'm now going to hand over to Kirsten. Thank you. Over to you, Kirsten.
Thank you very much, Joanne, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming in this lovely afternoon or morning, wherever you are from, to join us for our webinar. So today I'm going to be talking about artificial intelligence in conflicting environments. So what are we going to cover today? So first of all, I always like to start my webinars with a bit of definitions. Artificial intelligence is often used in different circumstances, so it's always good to get a fundamental understanding of what I mean by artificial intelligence and any other phrases that I use as part of that. We're then going to look at conflicting environments. So what actually do I mean by conflicting environments within this context? And also, why is AI important in these environments? Now, there could be positives and there could be associated negatives with that. So what are the considerations that need to be used around this? We can then look at the AI control and regulations. So especially in conflicting environments, suddenly this control is needed. And from that, we'll have a bit of a dive into the AI EU Act and what CAP AI is about. I will then close the session off with just some topics for consideration before we enter a Q&A session. So as Joanne said, please put any questions that you have throughout in the box, and I'll be happy to answer as many as we can at the end. So as I said, AI is a buzzword that gets used a lot, and different people have different understandings of what it means. So when I use artificial intelligence, it's basically the ability of a digital computer to perform tasks commonly associated with intelligent beings. Now, this in itself, due to that, intelligent beings can also be broad. I mean, what is intelligence? Human intelligence differs quite a lot from sort of animal intelligence. But this is kind of the fundamental definition of AI. Now, AI is actually an umbrella term, so there's lots of different techniques that we can see under AI. So we've got things like the large language models that are like quite a big sensation at the moment. But one of the key areas that I'll be talking about a bit is machine learning. So machine learning is any artificial intelligence technique that allows the computer to be trained rather than coded. And that's quite important when we're sort of diving into that control, that governance, and how we get trust in these systems. Now, another couple of definitions that often gets crossed over with AI and even each other is automation and autonomy. Now, automation is when something automatically runs within a very well-defined set of parameters and are very restricted in the tasks they can perform. So you often see this in sort of manufacturing units. There's sort of that automatic functions. Whereas when we talk about autonomy, this is when it's still automatic, but it then is able to learn and adapt to dynamic environments. So something that is classed as autonomy can have artificial intelligence included to have that learning and that adaptation as part of it, but it's not AI in itself. So that's quite a fine definition between the two. And I just wanted to get a base understanding of that, so if I start using these definitions, this is what I mean. Now, another key definition is what are conflicting environments and how do we define what conflict is? Now, when I was putting together this slide pack, I found this really good summation of what conflict is from Helpful Professor. And it shows how vast conflict actually is. So it refers to like disagreements, clashes, but this can be anything from sort of disputes to war. So if you think about all of that breadth in between, there are lots of different environments that can be conflicting environments. Now, most of these instances where we see conflict, they're often quite complicated and complex situations. I mean, even if you're talking about roommate dispute, as sort of has been documented there as like a micro example, it's still quite a complicated example. You know, you've got emotions, you've got different perspectives, you've got lots of data that both know and may not overlap knowledge. And I think that's very important because this is where AI can provide benefit into these very complicated environments. Now, just to go on to that machine learning a bit, and before we go on to some examples of conflicting environments and delve into a bit more on that side of things, I just wanted to make you aware on where AI and specifically machine learning are useful, and that is within these highly complex and multi-dimensional problem spaces that we as humans may not be able to comprehend, or we think we comprehend. But what machine learning and AI can actually do is think of different solutions to the problem space that we may not have thought of and come up with patterns that are almost invisible to the human eye. But because there are small sort of changes within the data, the machine itself is picked up. And that will be very important to sort of keep coming back to as we go through this webinar. So let's delve into our first conflicting environment. Now, obviously, there is loads and loads of different examples that I could pick from, but I try to keep 3 key examples that are kind of quite different from each other. And the first that I wanted to talk about is climate change, or global warming, however you want to view it. Now, within recent years, the impact of climate change is becoming increasingly more dangerous, and we can start to see that there are new patterns of behavior emerging. And this has been quite deadly. I mean, we've seen lots of wildfires, we've seen these extreme weathers, and we can't really piece together what's going to happen next or why things are happening. And this is an area where AI and ML technologies can give benefit. Now, previously I said it can start picking up solutions that humans may not think of. Now, if you think of this in a predictive space, so for instance, extreme weather patterns, when we're starting to get data coming in each year about these extreme weather, where it's happening, these small fluctuations as part of that multi-dimensional data set that we are building, we can now start using these technologies to try and understand what this data means, what patterns is performing, and predict what is likely to happen. Now, we also can have these features that to us as humans may seem like very isolated cases, but when you actually build up this pattern, this data set, this may actually not any longer be an isolated instance, and it can be analyzed, and it could actually be a broader pattern of behavior. Now, this is very key to then understand the full picture of what's happening and to really try and gain an advantage to be able to adapt and cope with this future altered weather patterns. Now, when I was writing this, I was very much looking at this optimistically. I was thinking about how AI and ML can actually really help us in the world of climate change. And it was only when I was at an event last week at the IET Savoy Place, and something kind of sparked in my mind, and it was a question that was about data centers. And obviously, specifically machine learning, where things need a lot of data to train upon and to build its accuracy, there needs to be large data centers. Now, the problem with this is this can actually increase carbon emissions, and also it's consuming a significant amount of electricity, and sort of saying that it could go up to sort of 20% of the world's electricity could be utilized by data centers. And this kind of got me thinking a bit when I came back and reflected on this slide a bit of, although, yes, there is a lot of instances for positive benefits to come out of AI and ML, there is still this underlying consideration needed when actually performing, even in the early life cycle of AI, of training, about how we're actually going to do this in an ecological way. Now, there are companies out there that are looking at how we actually go about making data centers a lot more energy efficient. There's a company called Carbon Z who's sort of leading the way with that technology of using sort of immersion cooling and redistributing the heat that's generated from them. So there are ways to go about it and at least limit both the electricity use and the carbon emission that goes with it. But again, it just goes to show that whenever there's a positive, there is a consideration that is also needed. So that was kind of like the first conflicting environment. I could go into these into a lot more detail, but I know that we've got a lot to get through. So I'll now change the pace up a little bit and actually go on to what a lot of people may see as a conflicting environment of the battlefield in war, things like this. Now, as I work for General Dynamics Mission Systems, this is often the area that I see myself working within, and this is why I always spend a lot of time looking at the ethics, the safety, the trust aspects of AI. But within the battle space, we're seeing increasingly complex situations with vast amounts of data being recorded and great impact to operator workload. Now, the people that are already deployed in the field are already overworked. They've already got so much on their mind. And this increasingly complex situations is just going to become overbearing. And the problem is when somebody has almost reached that operator burden, that mental burden limit, you start to miss things. Because us as humans, we're not machines. We get tired. We can't comprehend everything that's going on. And this is where AI can support. It can support us in that rapid understanding of the copious data that's coming in. But it can also help us in a lot of different instances. So things like command and control. We'd already seen in that sort of climate change type argument of that prediction. Well, if we can have prediction of enemy intent within sort of the command and control plans will be a lot more easier. We can actually save lives by understanding what the situation is and who's actually in play. We've got detection and identification now. We see a lot of systems that are within the visual domain, so it can detect cars, things like that. If you suddenly bring that into a battlefield, this can help operators to understand the situation that they are within. Now, we've already said analysis of big data. This is a very, very valid point, and I can't reiterate enough how much this needs to be looked at. But also things like adaptive controls, and this is where it fits into that autonomy piece that I was talking about. So some of the time we see sort of UAVs, drones, things like that being in control. The problem is when they're sort of automatic, they are very restricted, as we previously said. Now, when you actually put adaptive controls by utilizing AI and machine learning, you suddenly have a lot of flexibility with what you can do. And again, if you think about that detection identification, even in that rescue mission, instead of sending a person into the field, you can send a UAV with adaptive controls to sort of do that detection, identification, try and find out what is happening. And this is kind of where AI sits. It is trying to decrease the operator burden, increase the speed and quality of decision making, and securing operational advantage. Now, the issue with this is, well, there's a few issues with this. I think counter AI is something that gets overlooked. And what I mean by that is the adversary or the people that we're up against are already utilizing this type of technology, right? So how are we going to protect ourselves from that technology too? So if you build up and utilize AI machine learning, say within that adaptive controls within a UAV to do a search and reconnaissance, now, if we have the same level of technology as the adversary, and one gets taken out, so say our AI then suddenly gets taken out, we are left at a disadvantage. So we also need to understand how we counter AI to protect ourselves and the people within the field. Now, also, as I mentioned, the reason why I spend a lot of time within the ethics and safety is we obviously have sort of the law of armed conflict, right? We have a need for this AI. We understand that it will reduce the burden, but what are the risk assessments associated with it? Who's accountable for if anything goes wrong? There needs to be these audit trails and through-life perspectives to make sure that we fundamentally are staying within the laws of conflict. And this is sort of like a can of worms, and I can discuss this again for a long time. But there's lots of different considerations needed as part of that. And this will be something that I'll refer back to later on when I'm talking about that control and that governance piece and how important that actually is. So if we then move on to geopolitics, so we've sort of gone from the environment to the battlefield to actually the tension between countries themselves. Now, we often see when there's a sudden surge in technology, you have this technology race between different countries. One wants to be better than the other. And this is basically to take the lead in that development of technology. And this is what we see with AI at the moment. We sort of had quite a surge from sort of 2012 onwards, when we had more access to higher GPUs, things like that. And especially when we started to see things such as the large language models coming out, I think this has just increased this technological race to the lead. Now, we also see this because lots of different countries are seeking to exploit AI, with 75% of NATO nations having AI strategies in place. So it's not even just seeing things and observing them, but we know that this is needed because all of these nations have these strategies in place. Now, the problem almost with this is we as sort of nation states now have to work with AI technologies that are equal or greater intelligence that could cause risk to society. Now, I think this is where it's quite a unique example of this technological race. Now, although AI is very good in a sort of a bounded problem space, it's where it's the best. Within that problem space, it can be of greater intelligence than humans. And the problem is not being experienced in how to deal with this. Things like people being worried about losing their jobs, the writers' strike when ChatGPT came out, because suddenly you had a generative AI algorithm that could write things, there's suddenly this concern about the technology. And although you've got this race to be one up on the other, you've also got an internal worry of how this can be used. Will it take the jobs? And how do the states actually deal with that as well? So you've sort of got an external and an internal conflict. Now, I think most of the people agree that the AI development will significantly impact the shape of the future world. And it's kind of understanding how we incorporate it. How do we make sure that we use it as well as we can, whilst also protecting people? And there was this great quote that I found within the RAND, so it was all AI and geopolitics, how might AI affect the rise and fall of nations, which is a really great read. But there was this one quote that was, countries and companies will clash in new ways, and AI could be an actor, not just a factor. And I think that's really important because it is now becoming an actor. So giving another example with the chip war that we've seen between the US and China, AI was an actor in that. We had this technological race. We wanted to secure the fastest chips and everything. It has become a part of the clash between internal and external geopolitics. So I think that's a really interesting thing, and it will be interesting to see how this actually digresses. Now, we've sort of gone through the positives, potentially negatives of AI within sort of these three key conflicting environments that we've gone around. But I just wanted to reiterate, why is AI important in these environments? And this may be going over some points that I've already said, but the key thing is that the more complex a problem space is, the more we need to use more complex technical solutions. So things that can understand multidimensional data and find these hidden solutions that may be better than anything that I could have come up with. AI is able to improve our own accuracy and efficiency. We saw that within the slide on AI in Battlefield. It can reduce our cognitive burden. It can make us do our jobs better. Now, we've again said about the multidimensional and the vast data sets that it's able to handle, and the solutions that it can find are so significant. Now, one thing I do always like to reiterate, though, is AI isn't magic. It cannot solve everything. It is a solution to a defined problem. So AI is the tool. There needs to be a defined problem that it's going to solve. That is where it works best, within well-defined parameters. So since we just went on from geopolitics, and we said that, 75% of NATO nations are now having these AI strategies in place, we also are seeing sort of different controls and regulations in place from all different countries all over the world. Now, here in the UK, we had lots of different ethical guidelines coming out from different countries, from different companies, and it's really interesting to see how each is actually implementing them. Now, I understand that this obviously isn't all the countries in the world and all the regulations, but I thought that this was quite a nice way to show kind of some key things that are going on. So we can see within the US, they've sort of put quite a few things in force. You've got the AI Initiative Act, we've got sort of the local laws. If we go across to the EU, which I will expand on a little bit more, we sort of have the Artificial Intelligence Act, and obviously we've got the GDPR, so sort of that protection of data, which is quite similar to the Privacy Rights Act. Now, within Canada, there's also a proposed law, so the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. And here in the UK, we have sort of like a national AI strategy. Now, what I find quite interesting is some of these are already in force, and some of them are a proposed law. Some of them are just published. So we already see that loads of different countries are setting these out, they're putting them in place. And it will be interesting to see how they all align to each other to make sure that we reap the most benefit out of what we actually develop. Now, as I said, I'm going to go into a bit more detail about the EU AI Act and what CAP AI is. So what actually is this? So within the EU, they basically invited lots of AI experts to come together to basically put together some rules of the implementation of AI. And it was basically to mitigate the risk of failure and that whole lack of trust of the AI systems. Now, they came up with sort of very specific objectives. So they were looking that AI systems are safe and respected the existing laws on fundamental rights. They're able to sort of govern it, and again, it's that enforcement of law and rights and making sure that it's safe and trustworthy. And this is kind of the key objectives that they have set out. But the problem is how do you do that, right? You can set out that there's these objectives, that this is what you should do, but how do you actually implement it in sort of like a development life cycle? So they've basically come up with a system where the AI system has to have a use case associated with it. Now, I find this very interesting, and I think that this is great because we've sort of said that AI is a tool and it is used to solve a problem. So if we were to control the tool and technology itself, that would limit us quite drastically. So they're actually limiting based on what it is going to be used for. So how do we actually define the use case for the AI system? So this use case basically consists of who the stakeholders are, what is the problem that it's trying to solve, and how is it going to do that? Now, once this use case is actually put together, it then sort of gets decided into different risk levels associated to that use case. Now, to determine the risk level, it basically needs to be considered from three different perspectives. So the operational risk of failure, the security risk of sort of that interference, and the legal risk of failure. Now, these all together then indicates what the risk level is. So how drastic would the outcome be if it were to fail operationally? What's the legal implications if it was to fail? Now, we've sort of got these low risk, low to no risk, high risk, and then an unacceptable risk. Now, the unacceptable risk also includes completely prohibited AI practices. So things such as social scorings, use for like behavioral manipulation, using AI for that. So that's kind of the banned AI practices, and the use cases will always be prohibited. Now, when we get to sort of the high risk aspect of this, you then actually have to use something called CAP AI. Now, before we actually go into what actually CAP AI is and how does it benefit us within these sort of high risk categories, I found this really, really good example. It sort of expands out those different risk levels and gives some great examples of what these risks and use cases may be. So if we've got like the limited risks, this includes things like chatbots. You know, we see them from day to day. If things go wrong, yes, okay, it can be bad, but you know, the risk is limited. The high risk could be use in law enforcement, right? So suddenly if it goes wrong and it's being used in law enforcement, that's going to go seriously wrong. And then again, that prohibited unacceptable risk level is things like social scoring, mass surveillance. That is prohibited. So I think this is really good to have those examples next to the different risk levels. So we sort of said, okay, we've got this high-risk use case associated with an AI system. What do we do now? And that's where CAP AI comes in. So CAP AI was developed from the University of Oxford and was seen as an ethical-based auditing sort of tool. So it's a conformity assessment procedure based on sort of the three key principles that the AI EU Act identified, which were that the AI system should be lawful, ethical, and technically robust. So this procedure, as I said before, should be used when developing a system that has that high-risk use case associated with it. However, within the documentation, they also said that even at those low or no risk categories, it may actually be very useful to go through this procedure as part of the development lifecycle anyway, because then if there's anything that comes up when you're actually deploying the system, you can say, look, I've actually conformed to the AI EU Act. And it's just good practice at that half. So within CAP AI, it basically defines the process of these AI systems have 5 key life cycle stages, which can be seen sort of at the bottom here. So we've got that design stage where we actually have to define what the problem is, define how we're going to do it, that technical solution piece. We then go into the development life cycle, which is then, okay, we need to prepare the data set, we need to train the AI up. We then move on to the evaluation. So you've trained it, great. Now we need to test it, deploy it, see how it actually works. Does it work well? This is also where you collect lots of metrics to have that evidence to back you up. You can then go into that operation. So within the operational, it's been deployed. You then need to sustain it and maintain it. Now, there can be this update loop. Obviously, AI, specifically machine learning, if it's learning on data and you've suddenly got an influx of new data, which is quite significant to what you're doing, then retrain it, keep it up to date, and then go back through those sort of 2, 3, 4 stages. The final stage is then the retirement, so that deactivation of the AI system. Now, at each point of this life cycle, CAP AI basically defines 3 components. So you've got an internal review protocol. So this is basically a tool for quality assurance and risk management. So this is a very technical document that can be redacted, so it can be shared to others with sensitive information redacted out, but kind of is that risk management section. You've then got a summary data sheet, which is a high-level summary of the AI's purpose, so its functionality, its performance, all of that. And then lastly, you've got an external scorecard, which is basically a summarization of all the relevant information. So again, that purpose, the values, the data, and the governance. Now, although this says it can be optionally made available to the customers, to hit that sort of trust and that transparency, that external scorecard should be made available to all. Now, some of these will always be submitted to the EU, will be part of their public database, but all of these together allows sort of those organizations that have gone through this process to demonstrate that they conform to sort of the key principles laid out in the AI EU Act. Now, these documents, both CAP AI and the Act, are all publicly available. So if you are interested to delve into this further, I would recommend you go and have a look at it. They are quite long documents, but they are very, very good and actually pick out some quite good development challenges and also good practices to incorporate within AI development as part of sort of an organization. This even includes things such as the organizational governance, the supporting information, who should own those sort of pieces as part of that development lifecycle. So it's a really, really good if you're thinking about starting up development as AI within the company. So I could go into this a lot more detail, but I'm going to leave it at that point and just sort of go into topics for consideration now. If you've watched any of my webinars before, I sort of flash something similar up like this. And I think that it's very important to remember how many topics for consideration when we're talking about AI there is. Now, we've sort of had a lot of discussion around that governance piece today. So we were talking about the environment, how we're actually going to regulate the use case, not the technology. But there is a lot more around it as well. We've got, and all of them sort of overlap with each other quite a lot, but we've sort of still got things that we haven't covered in this session, such as sort of the safety and security, the ethics, the diversity, the interpretability of the AI. And these are all things that if you were going to go away, these need to be considered as well, just as much as sort of the governance and the internal protocols that we implement. Now, what I'd like to really finish on, because I really want to open this up for a bit more of a discussion and questions, but I just kind of want to take a bit of time on this slide, and it's basically the need for balance, right? So we understand that we need this control, we need the regulations to really make the use of AI but not exploit our fundamental rights. But if we put too many controls, then we actually could negatively impact innovation. Now, AI can help us in lots of different ways, and if we were to impact that, we wouldn't be anywhere near as affected as we could be. Now, a great example of positive effect, I mean, we've seen many throughout this presentation, but another one that I think is absolutely fascinating is sort of within the screening of breast cancers. There was around 20% more breast cancers that were detected using AI rather than traditional screening by radiologists. I mean, that is significant, and it just shows the benefit that we can reap. I've also included something that I'm very proud of, but it was part of my master's, and it was basically the detection of malarial versus non-malarial blood by sort of a machine learning pattern recognition tool on the patterns that were actually forming when the blood droplet was dried. And the idea was to actually implement a very cheap and effective way to detect malaria that could go into sort of third world countries. Now, this just shows that what we can get out of AI. And I think one of the main problems that people have with AI is people think that it's going to take our jobs. And with each of these examples, AI has its place to aid us, right? We are experts in our own fields, no matter what that may be. AI is there to assist us, and it will make us better at what we do. It is not there to replace us, but to maybe think of things a little bit more, pick up on things that we may have overlooked. And that is where it sits, and that is where it's most important. So I just want to leave us on something that I just wrote at the bottom. A balance between control and innovation is needed to ensure that we can collectively reap the benefits of AI without causing any detriment to fundamental rights and values. And if we achieve that, I think everybody will benefit from it. So I kind of rattled through that a little bit because I wanted to give a lot of time for questions, because I know there's lots of different areas that we've covered, and there's probably lots of interesting people out there that want stuff answered. So at this point, I would love to open the floor up a little bit and have a bit more of a Q&A session. So if anybody has any questions, please give them now.
Thanks, Kirsten. Fascinating presentation there. And as you predicted, we have a lot of questions to get through. So I'm just going to start from the top and read them out to you, and we'll try to get through as many as possible before the end of the hour. So I'm going to start straight away with, can AI solve the problem described in the chaos theory? For instance, the butterfly effect, basically.
That's interesting. And there's lots of different areas, and I'm not sure if anybody has tried to. I will hold my hands up to that. I'm not sure. It's not one that I've researched or know that people are researching. I think AI could find solutions that we may not think of. I think when you're coming to sort of a bit more of philosophical issues, there may be more issues with utilizing AI. And the only reason that I say that is we're in a time where people have different ways of sort of explaining this, but I sort of use the terms of narrow AI and broad AI. And broad AI is kind of where we've almost got something sentient, where like us humans, we pick up on loads of things around us. We can connect loads of different things and come up with an answer. Whereas within narrow AI, where we're at the moment, AI is very, very good, but in a sort of a well-defined problem space. Okay, so if we take that sort of detection recognition piece, the AI is great at detecting sort of cat and dog, but if you asked it what a bird looked like, well, it hasn't been trained on that. Like it's outside of that. And I think the issue with introducing almost that sort of more chaos, that butterfly effect, that introduces sort of almost like a philosophical element rather than like a maths problem or sort of like something that's a bit more well defined. So it would be interesting to see if anybody has researched that, but I would almost assume that at the moment it may not be able to solve anything that takes in almost that human element of that philosophical debate.
Oh, great stuff. Thanks for that, Kirsten. So next question. How do you balance the ethical consideration in Battlefield with AI implementation? And will this put us at a disadvantage when opposing party may not even consider it?
Yeah, so great. And I've sort of had questions sort of similar to this when we're within the UK, we are very ethical in terms of what we do. We try to conform as much as possible to fundamental rights and ethics. And it's also like, what if there are other countries that don't care, right? How can we protect ourselves from that? And that's very much when I was sort of discussing that counter AI. So the technology itself sort of opens up almost like a different way of thinking. And there needs to be an understanding of these systems to understand how we can counter it, right? So there's one advantage that we can gain by actually utilizing it, keeping within the ethical guidelines of it. So sort of being an extra pair of eyes, taking some cognitive burden off. But if our AI has been taken down or we haven't implemented that in the field and the adversary has got AI, we need to become more aware of how we counter that, for sure. And it can be done in different ways. So some of you may know things like there are different ways to trick AI, especially within the visual domain. So there was like an example from a autonomous car was going along, and there was a 30 sign, and somebody put like a 1 inch by 1 inch bit of tape on the 30 sign, and suddenly it tricked the car thinking it was like an 80 sign, so the car sped up to 80. And that's what you call sort of like an adversarial attack, where you change something by the appearance and it will recognize it as something else. So if the adversary has that sort of recognition technology and we understand how to almost hide ourselves in plain sight, that would almost level the playing field again. But there needs to be that core understanding about how we can actually do it and actually have some development on that technology and how do we counter it and how do we counter it in different fields, not just the visual domain as well. So it's definitely an area for research to make sure that we're never sort of at that disadvantage where the adversary has AI and we don't have anything to protect ourselves against it.
Okay, thanks, Kirsten. Next question. Now, some companies don't rely on AI because of bias and crash of models that might happen. How can we ensure that there is no bias like in space?
And that's a very good point. And bias is a big thing, and anybody who's worked with me will laugh when they hear that because I always try and badger on about bias and trying to avoid data bias, because it's a valid point, right? Within machine learning specifically, you can have data bias, and it's not a simple problem to overcome. There is things such as you've got personal bias, where you could actually be implementing bias on the data set. I mean, that somebody that's working on AI within those systems shouldn't be doing that anyway. But you do have things such as like historic bias, which is suddenly very difficult to overcome. And I think the best thing to do is work on the diversity of the data set. If you have sort of selection bias, so you've got a data set, quite a vast data set, but it's all centered around one single scenario, whatever that may be, then the AI is going to be biased on that single situation. So all of the edge cases around it, it's not going to perform anywhere near as well because it hasn't been trained on that. So you've also got that selection bias. So when you sort of grant that diversity of data set and try to implement all of the different situations that you could overcome, then we actually include a less biased data set. Now, that's easier said than done, right? If you're thinking about a multi-dimensional problem and you're trying to cover all different areas, that's never going to happen. But we can be more thoughtful in how we also use synthetic data. Now, training a machine learning technology just on synthetic data may not be appropriate, but we can use, where possible, synthetic data to almost define those edge cases a little, bulk it up a little bit more, to remove some of that selection bias that we may not have consciously made, but the data set has only focused on that. So, for instance, if we go back to an autonomous car, it will probably have loads and loads of data about just driving down a road at 60 on the motorway or 70 on the motorway with nothing happening. The problem is when something then happens unexpected that it's never seen before, it may not react in the way that it should because it's never seen that, and that's sort of that selection bias. So I think a lot of it is the diversity of the data set, and also going through it and making sure that there's not deliberately missing information, because that in itself is a bias. So there's this great case of credit cards, Apple credit cards, where they didn't want the credit cards giving out the percentages based on gender. They didn't want to bias the system. So what they did was they removed the gender column from the data set, thinking that everything was going to be solved. They then sort of deployed the system, and the women were getting still like 10 times higher rates than men were. And it just went to show how deeply rooted the bias was, that even without the gender column, there was still so much bias within the data set. And it's sort of that, if it had been more diverse, or if somebody had actually gone through and understood what that data was and how the bias is, and actually removing that column may have been biasing it further. So it's a difficult one to overcome, but there are ways to overcome it.
Okay, thanks, Kirsten. So I've got a comment from Adam and then leading on to a question. So Adam says, we will get to a stage where AI is used to create other AI solutions. And then he goes on to ask, do you believe this starts to blur the lines for development, understanding operation, and also responsibility for operation?
Yeah, good question, that. And I think it's a difficult one, I must admit. And I'm going to be answering in terms of machine learning rather than AI as a general. So if you don't mean machine learning, please let me know in the comments. Because I think where we've got to is we've got kind of this, with ChatGPT, you can ask it to code up something, right? You can sort of say, I want to do this, sort of code it for me. And it can come out with sort of like a structure, template. So there's abilities to do that. But I think when it comes to machine learning, you've got sort of the autonomous training as part of it. But where AI is best is when it's being trained by those who know their field. And what I mean by that is you may have a mass data set. Let's go back to sort of like the breast cancer screening. if there are ways for sort of machines to train itself, but they don't perform as well as if they have like a human labeling the data set, or even if it's in reinforcement learning, the human is actually tweaking like the reward function and stuff. What it needs is for the experts in the field to actually tell it what's right and what's wrong. That's where they're going to get the most benefit, and that's when they're going to increase in their accuracy and aid us as much. So I don't think we're there yet, and I'm not sure that we will be. In terms of simpler forms of AI, like decision trees and things like that, yeah, potentially. But there still needs to be that knowledge transfer from human to machine to actually get it to do what it needs to do. I don't know if I answered both questions there.
I'm sure our questioner will let us know if not. So,
Thank you.
So let's move on. A very quick question here from Alan. Is there a register of submissions to the EU AI Act?
So I'm not too sure at the moment. The EU AI Act was, I think it was submitted in like 2019, and it's a proposed law at the moment. So I'm not too sure if the whole pipeline into it is already up and running, and if so, where that database is. Not too sure on that, and that's definitely one for me to go away and have a look and read up on.
Okay, great. We'll come back to you on that, Alan. Okay. So I have a question now from Irene, and she's asking about safety in AI within a company. And she's asking, what would be the best practice to enable people to learn how to use AI in order to gain a lot from it? What type of rules or guidelines should there be?
That's a good question, because I think the more things like ChatGPT is out there, you think people that are students already using it to aid them, people are becoming to use it more as a tool to aid their day-to-day life. And I love the way that was phrased as it's not an outright ban from the company, because that's never the right way to go about it. There are definitely rules and regulations that have been put in place in organizations to not only protect the people within the company and sort of the products that they develop, but also to minimize the risk of leaking IP, right? So if you suddenly go on and you start typing stuff that contains all IP and you sort of say submit, where does that actually get stored? How is that then protected, or does it get stored anywhere? There's sort of quite a concern about that. So the guidelines that I often see is that you don't use it with anything that's IP related. So if you needed like a document structure, yeah, great, go and use it. There's also usually guidelines on not sort of directly implementing stuff that's come from generative AI specifically. So it can generate a template for you to follow, but that's kind of the limit of it. You can't be writing like formal documents at the moment with that's all been generated, because what's the quality of it, all of that. So there's some guidelines out there on terms of generative AI. I guess a lot of other things to do with AI, I mean, you see them in manufacturing quite a lot when within sort of the detection of like thickness of things. And I think the worry about the safety of these systems are usually in the context where they haven't been used before. And there is always going to be that concern of what happens if it goes wrong. And I think it's only until you start using them, figure out what the benefit is, figure out what the limitation of it is, so then you can actually come up with specific guidelines to that organization, because everybody's going to be a bit different in how they want to control it. So I think the people that are making those guidelines kind of have some base rough ideas. So don't use anything that's generated, only use it for templates, don't use IP, but then go and actually have a play and sort of try and get a feel for how you would use it and how you wouldn't want others to use it, to really sort of tie down those guidelines.
Okay, thanks, Kirsten. So I've got a question now from Stabber, who is in Norway, and he's asking, can CAP AI be supervised and enhanced using AI? it gives an example using large language models and other supporting AI tools and techniques.
Mm. I would imagine that it could at some point. I don't think that it will at any point. And I think the only reason that I say that, and it is a personal opinion, they may go and sort of develop an integration to it or whatever. But the reason I say that is it's sort of an assessment piece to assess an AI. So I don't know how, it would almost be a domino effect, I would imagine, that they would have to have a bespoke large language model for CAP AI that is already verified and everything. Otherwise, if you use AI to do the AI assessment, then how do you know the AI that you've used conforms to that assessment that you're trying to create, right? So you end up with this sort of domino effect. So I would imagine for the time being, it would be very much a sort of, it could be potentially auto-filled, things like that within the company, but I would imagine it would almost follow sort of more standard processes within an organization for the time being.
Okay, fabulous, thank you. Well, I've got a question from a student now, computer security student, who'd like to know the capability of implementing AI in that field, so computer security student.
Oh, that's good, because there's a lot that you could be doing. And yeah. I think also that's a really good sector to be doing or thinking about doing AI within, because cyber security, sort of computer security sort of thing is a very complex field in its own right, you know, and AI's been looked at for monitoring for attacks. So because machines are able to detect very small differences within signals, let's say, they are much more prone to picking up when attacks are happening. So things like cyber attacks, network attacks, things like that. So there's a lot going on around protecting computer systems, network-enabled systems, things like that, by monitoring and flagging when these like small differences occur. Because the best thing is to flag it. If you flag it and nothing happens, fine. If you don't flag it and something happens, then that's a failure on the AI, or on the human. So I really think that sort of subfield of that protection of sort of attacks and network would be a really interesting and good field to get into. And there's lots of different areas around that, which would be very fascinating to get into.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks for that. So we're coming up close to the hour now, so I think we can probably squeeze 2 more questions in if that's okay with you, Kirsten.
Yeah.
So I'll start off with one from Luke, and he's asking, are there any predicted timelines for true AGI being developed? What policy has been foreseen or planned to manage it?
So there is, I don't want to say disagreement. That's sort of like a negative term. But there are differences of opinions on AGI. People say that we've already reached AGI, and sorry for those of you that's sort of that general AI that we were talking about, so rather than the narrow. And I think to get to that point, there needs to be a lot more advancements. And whether we'll ever achieve true, I'm not too sure at the moment. There's a lot of issues within the technology and sort of the compute resources as well. So I wouldn't want to put any numbers on what true sort of general AI would be like. And I think that sort of is reflected within the guidelines as well, because at the moment everything is very much based around what AI is at the moment, which is very that narrow field. So how do we make sure that that narrow field and that AI system that does that specific use case is safe, is ethical, is sort of trusted? So at the moment, I doubt that there will be any guidelines out there for sort of that more general AI, because I'm not too sure that people think that we're going to achieve it, or if we will achieve it, I would say that we were quite far off, in my opinion.
Okay, thanks. Okay, one more. Do the governance rules ensure? Yeah, sorry, Kirsten. Do the governance rules ensure that you check the learning AI is still improved? For example, the breast cancer detection was 20% better. Is it still 20% better?
So, as in sort of that sort of through life maintenance. Yeah, so within CAP AI, you've got the 5 sort of life cycle stages, and part of that defined life cycle was that deployment, where you're actually maintaining the system. So those 3, I can't remember what I called them, where they're artifacts, are for each stage of that life cycle. So when it's been deployed, it still needs to be maintained. It needs to be updated with its learning. And as part of that, you'll be getting the metrics out to then submit to that sort of external scorecard. How often that's been done, I'm not too sure, as in you don't want to be doing it every day. But there needs to be a level of checking the metrics, making sure that they're still accurate enough to then submit to make sure you are still aligning to the EU AI Act. So yes, it definitely would cover that and needs to be done during maintaining deployment.
Okay, brilliant. All right, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much, Kristen, for the presentation itself, but also for gamely going through as many questions as we could do today. It's been my pleasure to host this webinar today, and thank you to everyone who's joined us. It's really great to see so many of you and from so many different parts of the world as well. We do hope you found this webinar worthwhile. I would ask, it's a plea really, to give us your feedback after the event. You'll get a survey link when the presentation closes down. This really does help the network to plan future events and webinars. As I say, we did have a lot of questions, and I'm really sorry that if we didn't read out your question, but we will endeavour to follow up any of the unanswered questions directly afterwards by email. And just on that note, you will get an email shortly after this presentation closes today, which will give you a link to the recorded webinar if you want to watch again on demand. So thanks once again to everyone, and close the webinar now by saying take care and stay safe, everyone. Thank you.